What you see here is not an ordinary attack. This is the beginning of the end. A swarm of 251 kamikaze drones pierced the darkness of night and locked onto their target. The target was the Feodosia oil refinery, the last major local fuel source in Crimea. With an annual capacity of 250,000 tons, this facility was a logistical hub supplying fuel to both the Russian occupation army and the Black Sea Fleet. This explosion did not just destroy tens of thousands of tons of fuel, it also pulled the plug on the peninsula's life support system. This was the moment the last domino fell. Fuel shortages in Crimea are no longer a crisis. They are part of everyday life. More than half of the stations are completely empty. Not only vehicles, but cities, people, and nerves are parched. Before dawn, Crimeans take their jerry cans and hit the road, waiting in line for hours, sometimes days, to find gasoline. However, most return home exhausted, angry, and helpless without seeing any fuel. When night falls, the streets take the place of gas stations. People pull up next to each other's cars and quietly try to siphon gasoline from the tanks. For every Crimean with a car, finding fuel is now the primary concern, not transportation. And at the few stations that are open, prices have risen to 80 rubles. This makes fuel an almost inaccessible luxury for low-income groups. The Kremlin has resorted to desperate measures. It has dusted off the ration card system from the Soviet era and launched a distribution model limited to 20 liters per person. But this measure does not solve the problem either. The recent attacks have further exacerbated the existing problems, like pouring gasoline on a fire, because bringing fuel into Crimea from outside is now almost impossible. The damaged Kerch Bridge cannot carry heavy tankers. The sea route is the hunting ground of the Ukrainian Navy. The railways are under constant threat of sabotage. This is the story of how a peninsula, along with all its military and civilian mechanisms, became trapped, suffocated, and gradually dragged into total chaos. Russia's impregnable fortress, Crimea, is now stranded on an island without fuel, and the panic is just beginning. This devastating blow was not a coincidence that emerged overnight. On the contrary, it was the final and most deadly link in a flawless strategic strangulation operation, woven meticulously over months with patience and intelligence. To understand the flames in Feodosia, we must first see the previous steps Ukraine took to turn Crimea into a living corpse, how it tightened the steel vise around the peninsula. This is an unprecedented logistical siege in modern warfare history. Kiev systematically severed every artery supplying blood to the peninsula, ensuring the body was completely defenseless before delivering the final blow to the heart. It all began with the systematic elimination of Crimea's local fuel production and storage capacity. This was a strategy we could call the Crimean fuel trap. Long before Feodosia was hit, Ukraine's long-range drones had targeted critical refineries on the Russian mainland that supplied Crimea. The Tuapse refinery in Krasnodar was hit repeatedly, losing a significant portion of its production capacity. Thermal data published by NASA's firm's satellite imaging system clearly confirmed weeks of uncontrollable fires. These attacks dried up the closest and most vital fuel supply points to Crimea at the source. The peninsula was becoming increasingly dependent on its own limited reserves. Looking at the map, Ukraine's moves are clearly visible. All external fuel sources around Crimea were marked in red one by one, and the circle was slowly closing in. Feodosia was the last green spot inside this circle, and it too was wiped out by that massive attack of 251 UAVs. Crimea now had no meaningful fuel production or refining capacity left within its borders. Once local sources were dried up, the second and more ruthless phase of the plan kicked in. Kiev blocked every route that could bring fuel into Crimea from outside. The first and most symbolic of these routes was the Kerch Bridge, Putin's biggest propaganda project. Repeated precision strikes irreparably weakened the bridge's structural integrity. The bridge was no longer safe for heavy fuel tankers to cross by rail or road. Each tanker could trigger a collapse in the damaged sections of the bridge. As a result, the shipment of tens of thousands of tons of fuel via this critical artery was completely halted. The bridge may still be standing, but its function as a logistical lifeline has been halted. The sea route was put in an even worse situation. Ukraine has turned the Black Sea into a laboratory for asymmetric naval warfare. Explosive-laden naval drones have either confined the once mighty Russian Black Sea Fleet to port or sent it to the bottom of the sea. This threat was not limited to warships. Civilian ferries and cargo ships carrying fuel and ammunition have now become unprotected targets. According to leaked information, insurance companies have raised premiums to exorbitant levels for ships operating on this route, and many ship owners have refused to send their ships on this deadly mission. Ferry services were constantly being cancelled on the grounds of a terrorist threat. Thus, supplying Crimea by sea became virtually impossible. Only one unsafe option remained: the railway. However, this line was also under constant attack from Ukrainian partisan groups and special forces. Explosives placed on the tracks, cyber attacks on signaling systems, and small-scale sabotage of bridges made rail transport extremely slow, risky, and unreliable. The amount of fuel a single train could carry was a drop in the bucket compared to the peninsula's enormous needs. When Feodosia was hit, all doors were closed for Crimea. The peninsula could no longer safely obtain fuel either by bridge, sea, or from neighboring regions. Logistically completely isolated, it had become a powder keg left to fend for itself with its meager resources. And on the night of October 6th, the final match was struck. The oil depot at the port of Feodosia was the last hope for this isolated peninsula. The last major reserve, vital for both civilian cars and generators, as well as S-400 batteries, tank battalions, and fighter jets, was stored here. That night's operation was not focused on a single point. It was part of a massive wave of attacks involving a total of 251 UAVs, designed to completely overwhelm and paralyze Russian air defenses. While energy facilities and military bases in different parts of Russia were targeted simultaneously, the deadliest wing of this swarm was directed at Feodosia. Russian air defense systems were helpless against this flood of threats filling the sky. Leaked civilian videos showed UAVs diving into the facility one after another, followed by secondary explosions lighting up the sky. This was proof that the target had been hit with precision and that tens of thousands of tons of fuel had been destroyed in flames. The strategic encirclement was complete. Crimea's lifeline was severed in a single night. It wasn't just oil that burned that night. What burned that night was Russia's very ability to hold Crimea. The Crimean people, who had been largely spared the devastation of the fighting since the beginning of the war, were confronted with the most brutal face of war, the collapse of their daily lives. As soon as news of the fire in Feodosia spread, a wave of panic swept across the peninsula. Within hours, queues stretching for miles formed in front of gas stations. Leaked footage from local telegram channels showed angry people waiting for hours, even days, to get a drop of gasoline, drivers fighting each other, and helpless officials unable to control the situation. Prices skyrocketed tenfold on the black market. Even those with money couldn't find gasoline, and for ordinary citizens, starting their cars became a pipe dream. Combined with the complete shutdown of public transportation, this situation brought life to a sudden halt. People could not get to work, children could not get to school, and patients could not get to hospitals. Hospitals, bakeries, and markets that depend on generators faced the threat of shutting down their services because they could not find fuel. The agricultural sector came to a sudden halt as tractors and harvesters ran out of fuel. This was not just a transportation crisis, but also a harbinger of a food and health crisis. The puppet administration appointed by Russia to Crimea was powerless to manage this massive crisis. Their calls for calm were lost amid the noise of empty gasoline cans and angry crowds. The Kremlin's narrative of a stable, secure, and prosperous Russian Crimea, built over years, was crumbling in a fight at a gas station, in the silence of a stopped bus, and in the muteness of a generator. And this was not only affecting civilian life, the military front was also collapsing. The Russian occupation force of more than 60,000 soldiers in Crimea is literally suffocating from lack of fuel. To understand the anatomy of this military disaster, one must look at the geographical and logistical reality of Crimea. The peninsula's entire fuel needs depended on a single lifeline from mainland Russia, the Kerch Bridge, which was constantly under threat from Ukraine, or risky sea shipments. This fuel, reaching Crimea, was stored in massive oil and fuel storage terminals located in centers such as Sevastopol and Feodosia, scattered across different points of the peninsula. These terminals were the lifelines that sustained not only civilian life, but also tanks, ships, warplanes, and tens of thousands of soldiers. The campaign, dubbed Deep Strike by Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, is precisely a surgical operation aimed at severing these arteries. The targeting of 85 high-value targets over the past 2 months, including 33 military facilities and 52 military-industrial facilities on Russian territory, is proof of how systematic this strategy is. By repeatedly striking these massive fuel depots, which are the lungs of Crimea, Ukraine has blocked the peninsula's airways. Even if fuel were to arrive via the Kerch Bridge, there are no longer any secure, large-capacity centers to store and distribute it. The repercussions of this situation on the front lines are devastating for the Russian army. As Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi has stated, this fuel crisis is a more effective weapon than bullets. A T-90 tank on the front line is $1 million pile of metal without the diesel to move it. It stops the truck carrying the cannon that fires the bullets to the front line, the armored vehicle protecting that truck, and the generator of the command center managing the entire operation. Warplanes and helicopters cannot take off from their bases without a constant flow of fuel. Ukraine is simply neutralizing expensive Russian military equipment by eliminating the cheap fuel that powers it. This is the root cause of the Russian army's forward operating capability. Ukraine has implemented all of this after months of meticulous planning and preparation. Moreover, the impact of these operations was not limited to the Crimean Peninsula. According to data from the Moscow Times and the analytical firm Ciala, by the end of September, approximately 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity, or the ability to process about 338,000 tons of crude oil per day, had been taken offline. Approximately 70% of these disruptions were directly attributable to Ukraine's UAV attacks. In September alone, 4 major refineries, among the largest in Russia, were forced to halt operations. These included the Kryvyi-Rih facility in the Leningrad region, Russia's second-largest refinery, and the Ryazan refinery owned by Rosneft, one of the country's top 5. These attacks crippled about a quarter of Russia's total refining capacity, or a processing volume of 236,000 tons per day. The result was inevitable. In September, gasoline production fell by a full 1 million tons, creating a shortfall of up to 20% of national consumption. The Kremlin's response to the crisis painted a humiliating picture for the once energy superpower. Russia was forced to completely ban gasoline exports. Worse still, it sought emergency imports to meet its own needs. Russian media reported plans to import up to 300,000 tons of gasoline per month from Belarus, and that a 5% customs duty on imports from Asian countries such as China, South Korea, and Singapore had been lifted. A country that once threatened Europe with energy supply now found itself begging its allies for fuel to run its own cars and tanks. This situation was the clearest evidence that one of Russia's fundamental geopolitical doctrines, namely the doctrine of energy-based power projection, was rotting from within. Moreover, this decay began to affect the Russian economy. The State Development Bank (VEB) confirmed that the country had entered a textbook technical recession by forecasting a 0.6% contraction in GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. Even Sberbank's president, German Gref, admitted that the economy was sliding into technical stagnation. The Finance Ministry's plans to raise VAT from 20% to 22% to finance defense and security spending show that this burden is being shifted onto the shoulders of ordinary Russians. This situation brings to mind a dangerous historical parallel. In January 2022, protests that began with a sudden increase in fuel prices in Kazakhstan quickly turned into a nationwide political uprising and overthrew the Nazarbayev dynasty, which had ruled the country for 30 years. When the Kremlin fails to deliver on its promise to provide its people with basic necessities, foremost among them the freedom of movement, it risks being crushed under its own weight. The promise of stability is now gone. As a result, Vladimir Putin's iron fist is losing its grip. And this is most evident in Crimea. The smoke rising in Feodosia is also a sign that an era is coming to an end in Crimea. By replacing brute force with strategic intelligence, Ukraine has shown the world how to dismantle the military and civilian mechanisms of a peninsula. This is not just a series of successful military operations, but also a battle of wills that has turned the enemy's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. Today, Crimea is an isolated piece of land that is becoming increasingly difficult to defend militarily and increasingly impossible to live in civilly. The peninsula, presented by Putin as the unshakable bastion of the Russian world, is now drowning under its own logistical wreckage. The myth of Crimea as a bastion is breathing its last breath in the endless queues at gas stations and the uncertainty on people's faces. So what do you think? Can Russia continue to hold Crimea under this strategic siege? And will this logistical collapse bring about the end of the Putin regime? Share your valuable opinions and analyses with us in the comments section. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to support our independent analyses.